Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com, setting the record straight about climate. In this video, I'm going to cover two aspects of NASA climate fraud. NASA has a webpage, Climate Change, How Do We Know? This webpage is chock full of misinformation from one end to the other. And I'm going to go ahead and answer the question for them. They have no idea what's going on with the climate. This video is just going to cover one talking point from that page, glacial retreat. They say glaciers are retreating almost everywhere around the world, including in the Alps, Himalayas, Andes, Rockies, Alaska, and Africa. This statement is true, but it has nothing to do with man-made climate change. Glaciers have been retreating for almost all of the last 20,000 years. In this video, we're going to look specifically at the behavior of glaciers over the last 200 years, and how well the history of glaciers correlates with NASA's global temperature graph. This is NASA's current land-ocean temperature graph, and it shows that Earth has been warming fairly steadily since about the year 1910. And we're going to compare that NASA graph with this 1974 graph from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, which showed something very different. The NCAR graph from 1974 showed that 1970 was no warmer than 1870, a century earlier. The graph showed a lot of warming from 1910 until 1940, and then all of that warming was lost by 1970. Nothing like what the NASA graph showed. In this presentation, I'm going to be showing you a lot of slides like this one. There will be an article on the left and the NASA temperature graph on the right. And this blue arrow down here is very important. It shows the date of the article. Keep your eye on that blue arrow throughout the presentation. This article is from National Geographic in 1896, and the article says that Alaska's largest glacier, the one in Glacier Bay, retreated 40 miles between 1794 and 1896. That means the glacier retreated almost 6 feet per day during the 19th century. And the NASA graph shows that that period was very cold and actually getting colder. So Alaska's largest glacier was rapidly retreating during a cold period of global cooling. This is the exact opposite of the story which NASA wants you to believe. I've already shown you enough information to demonstrate that glacial retreat has nothing to do with man-made climate change. And you've also seen enough information to see that glaciers retreat even during NASA's coldest years on record. So NASA's claim is bogus. Glacial retreat is not due to man-made climate change like they're inferring. But I'm just getting started. Here's a map from the United States Geological Survey showing the retreat of the glacier at Glacier Bay, Alaska. You can see the tremendous retreat which occurred from 1794 until 1880. Atmospheric carbon dioxide was below 300 parts per million at the time. NASA wants you to believe that all of this retreat was natural, and NASA also wants you to believe that the last little bit of retreat was man-made. The message which NASA is pushing is absurd. Now let's fast forward to 1902 and look outside of Alaska. Alpine glaciers disappearing. The famous glaciers of the Rhone have shrunk several thousand feet in the last 20 years. Now let's look at the blue arrow. This was occurring during the coldest years on record according to NASA, when temperatures were actually declining. Now we're going to look at Greenland in 1903, melting glaciers. Observations of alpine glaciers during a series of years have supplied proof that these great ice streams have long been in process of recession. And Dr. Engel of Copenhagen has shown conclusively that the Jakobshavn Glacier in Greenland is also receding. And this map showed the recession of that glacier since 1861. The glacier retreated a lot from 1851 until 1964, and then the recession slowed down quite a bit. But look what's happened over the last 3 years. NASA reports that the glacier has been growing for 3 consecutive years. And let's look at the blue arrow. It's way over here on the right side. NASA shows that the glacier is growing during their hottest years on record. But the glacier was rapidly retreating during their coldest years on record. So the glacier was advancing when it's hot and CO2 levels were high, but it was retreating when it was cold and CO2 levels were low. This should raise a big red flag that NASA has no idea what they're talking about. Now let's go back and look at another article from 1903. Glaciers disappear. The ice in Greenland is melting more rapidly than it's formed. Comparison of the descriptions of the Jakobshavn Glacier shows that its edge has receded 8 miles since 1850 and that it's lost 20 to 30 feet in depth. The article below it is also interesting. Socialism in New Zealand. New Zealand has gone farther than any other nation in realizing the ideal state of the socialist. Bernie Sanders will be very disappointed to find out that glaciers were rapidly retreating during this socialist nirvana. Now let's go to Antarctica in 1906. South Pole warming up. Since the first visit to the ice cap of the South Pole was made some 50 years ago, there has been a steady recession of the belt of some 30 miles. So the Ross ice shelf around Antarctica retreated about 8 feet per day from 1850 until the beginning of the 20th century. And once again, this was while carbon dioxide levels were very low and NASA showed that Earth was cooling. More bad news for climate alarmists and socialists. Remember to follow the arrow. Now we're up to 1910, NASA's coldest years on record. Glaciers are retreating. Scientists say that save over a small area, the glaciers of the world are retreating to the mountains. So glaciers were retreating all over the world during the coldest years on record. Same story in 1917. Glaciers were receding all over the world. By 1922, the Ross ice shelf in Antarctica had retreated by 40 miles. By 1923, North Pole melting, many glaciers vanished. Is the North Pole going to melt entirely? Reports from fishermen, seal hunters, and explorers who sail the seas around Spitsbergen and the eastern Arctic all point to a radical change in climatic conditions, with hitherto unheard of high temperatures on that part of the Earth's surface. So the Arctic was really hot in 1923, but let's look at the blue arrow. That sure doesn't show up in NASA's graph. NASA shows temperatures in 1923 being close to the coldest on record. If you're not getting suspicious about this NASA temperature graph already, you should be. 1923, Glacier Park melting at a rapid rate in scientists' opinion. Professor Waterman predicted that Glacier Park would be largely ice-free by the year 1948. And here's another article from 1926 predicting that a new generation will never see glaciers in Glacier National Park. And NASA is still showing this as some of the coldest years on record. 1924, Colorado glaciers disappearing. Once again, NASA is showing it very cold. 1927, Canadian glaciers disappearing. 1930, New York Times, Switzerland's alpine glaciers are in full retreat. And NASA is still showing temperatures close to the coldest on record. 1932, a warmer world, glaciers retreating all around the world. Also in 1932, hundreds of small glaciers have disappeared from Yosemite National Park in California. 1934, glaciers are now on the retreat, and NASA is still showing it very cold. 1935, New York Times, an ice age passes, glaciers are disappearing. 1936, the United States Geological Survey predicts that Glacier National Park will be ice-free by 1961, the year which Barack Obama was born. 1939, it may without exaggeration be said that the glaciers of eastern Greenland, like those in Norway, face the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. So the glaciers of Greenland and Norway were nearing catastrophic collapse, and NASA still shows temperatures close to the coldest on record. Glaciers were retreating all over the world. This NASA temperature graph defies credibility. By 1939, winter temperatures around Spitsbergen had warmed 16 degrees, but it didn't show up at all in this NASA temperature graph. 1940, another prediction of an ice-free Glacier National Park. Also in 1940, glaciers at Mount Rainier, Washington are disappearing. Another one from 1940, ice in Arctic melting rapidly. 1947, temperatures in the Arctic have warmed up 10 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900, an enormous rise from the scientific standpoint. And people living in the lowlands along the shores are going to be inundated by water from melting ice. 1951, Greenland's ice is melting, and in the process, ruins of ancient farmhouses and other relics have been exposed. So Greenland was a lot warmer when the Vikings lived there, but that's another completely different story about the fraud from Michael Mann. 1952, the polar ice caps are melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and threatening to swamp seaports by raising ocean levels. The glaciers of Norway and Alaska are only half the size they were 50 years ago. 1954, Canada had to move their largest Arctic settlement because of melting permafrost. 1955, half of Arctic sea ice had disappeared. There are now 6 million square miles of ice in the Arctic. There once were 12 million square miles. And another thing, almost every glacier, with one exception, has retreated, going back into the hills. In 1958, the New York Times predicted that the Arctic Ocean would open during the lifetime of our children, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. This sequence of pictures from National Geographic showed the massive retreat of glaciers in Austria from 1900 until the 1950s. But around the year 1960, things changed very suddenly. There was a unanimous consensus of scientists by 1961 that Earth was getting colder. By 1963, Norway's glaciers were growing for the first time in 200 years. Now let's take a look at the blue arrow again. NASA shows temperatures in 1963 much warmer than in 1910, when glaciers were rapidly disappearing. So according to NASA's temperature graph, glaciers were growing in 1963 when it was warm, but they were disappearing very quickly in 1910 when it was cold. Obviously that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. By 1970, the United States and the Soviet Union were worried about why the Arctic climate was becoming more frigid and why parts of the Arctic sea ice have recently become ominously thicker, and whether the extent of that ice cover contributes to the onset of ice ages. By 1973, there was a full-blown ice age scare. Pack ice around Iceland is once again becoming the serious hindrance to navigation it was during the Little Ice Age of the 17th and 18th centuries. The NASA temperature graph shows temperatures much warmer in 1973 than in 1910, when glaciers were rapidly disappearing. And by 1976, National Geographic was reporting that glaciers in Switzerland had begun advancing again. The U.S. National Science Board reported that during the last 20 to 30 years, world temperatures fallen irregularly at first but more sharply over the last decade. So the U.S. Science Board said in 1974 that Earth was cooling very rapidly during the prior decade, but NASA has completely erased that cooling. And this was the cover of Science News on March 1, 1975. The Ice Age cometh, glaciers plowing through Manhattan. Now let's look at the credibility of NASA's temperature graph in the context of what we've just learned about history. They show glaciers rapidly disappearing when it's cold, and they show glaciers growing and sea ice growing when it's warm. It's pretty obvious that this NASA temperature graph bears no resemblance to reality. Now let's compare history to the 1974 NCAR graph. The NCAR graph showed ice melting when it's warm and ice forming when it's cold. So the NCAR graph corresponds with reality, but it doesn't correspond with global warming theory. So climate scientists decided to erase this warmth of the 1940s and the subsequent cooling into the 1970s. This ClimateGate email shows how scientists from multiple government agencies in different countries colluded to alter the temperature record. This is Tom Wigley at NCAR writing to Phil Jones at the University of East Anglia, and he copied Ben Santer from Lawrence Livermore National Laboratories. They were talking about trying to get rid of the 1940s warming blip, as they called it. If we could reduce the ocean blip by, say, 0.15 degrees Celsius, then this would be significant for the global mean, but we still have to explain the land blip. It would be good to remove at least part of the 1940s blip, but we're still left with why the blip. So they wanted to get rid of the 1940s warmth, and they didn't even have an explanation for why they were going to do it. This is known as policy-based evidence making. It's not science these people are doing, it's fraud. And here's another ClimateGate email from Phil Jones on the same topic. The skeptics will make a meal of this. It relates to a problem with SST data in the late 1940s. And it shows once again that they wanted to reduce the 1940 to 1970 cooling, even though they didn't have a good explanation for why they were doing it. The BBC has a brand new program out explaining that the ClimateGate emails expose nothing nefarious. But for some reason the BBC forgot to interview me before they made their propaganda film rewriting history. Let's summarize what we've learned. NASA temperature graphs bear no resemblance to reality and are not credible. And their claim that melting glaciers is evidence of man-made climate change is also not credible. Glaciers were rapidly melting long before CO2 levels started rising. This whole climate change scam is a multi-trillion-dollar farce. There's no science behind it, and it threatens billions of people. If you want to get this scam stopped, please pass my videos around, subscribe to my YouTube channel, and follow me on Twitter. And of course, visit Toto on the web at realclimatescience.com. He's been pulling back the curtain on junk science and propaganda for a long time.